Welcome to the EACC's Autumn EU Economic Update. How much closer will Europe have to come together to stay warm this winter? This event is organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce in collaboration with the EU delegation to the United States. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC New York, and I will be your host and moderator for today's event. My conversation partners include Deborah Revoltella. She's the Global Chief Economist at the European Investment Bank, Balázs Barkanavi, Counselor for Economic and Financial Affairs at the EU delegation to the US, and Ben Carlina, the Senior Economist at the EU delegation to the US. Let's dive right into the conversation. Coming out of COVID, what did we learn? What was the state of the economy at the end of 2021, and what has changed? We're dealing now with increased inflation, and that dented to some degree the post-pandemic euphoria ahead of the war. The real GDP growth in the first half of the year beat expectations, but consumer confidence is down, and so are projections for the first quarter. Ben and Balázs, where are we in broad strokes, and what are we dealing with right now?
Yeah. Well, really, the story, I think, from the beginning, the first half of this year was a post-pandemic recovery story that was very positive. And compared to previous forecasts, growth was better than expected. You had, as COVID restrictions went away, you saw this huge return boost in spending driven by consumers going out and doing traveling and tourism and going out to restaurants and stuff like that. And then businesses reacted to the increase in demand by boosting investment. And on top of that, you still had the public sector that was still providing pandemic support in some cases. So growth was very strong and people were feeling good. And that's why the war in Ukraine was such a shock to the system.
Yeah, I just wanted to add some to sprinkle in some numbers to better sort of present the case. So actually, if the first half of the year, first 2 quarters of this year was very strong in Europe, as opposed to the US, where we had a technical recession. And the first half growth was 4.9% in Europe compared to the same period the year ago. And this was, as Ben was saying, mostly due to pent-up demand and also excess savings that the households had at the time. For example, the savings rate went up during the COVID from 13% of gross disposable income in 2019 to 21%. So it's 50% higher than it was. So it shows how much people had extra savings available to them that led to this vibrant growth in the first half of this year.
So looking at that, Deborah, the EIB had done its annual investment survey, talking to corporates during the summer and releasing the results last week. What was the sentiment that you heard from corporates about their plans to invest and generally, how the business environment is?
So I think it's a very interesting picture, and I very much reconnect to what Ben and Balázs were just saying on how we were coming out from the pandemic. In fact, I think the pandemic was quite interesting in terms of what happened to firms. All of us, when considering the ex ante, when COVID happened, we all were starting to forecast what would happen to firms, to non-performing loans, and the very negative views on the transmission of the shock. In reality, what happened was that then it was a sudden stop of the economic activities, but also very strong rebound, as Ben and Balázs were saying, and policy support was strong. So what we see, and that's a very complicated graph, but think about on the left, you would see that the firms that were impacted by COVID that actually had a decrease in sales in 2020 or 2021. In Europe, there were 50% of the firms. But what you see on the right is where these firms expected during the summer, end of 2022, to be versus 29. So would have they recovered completely or not from the shock? And what you see is actually that most of those that were hit in 2020 and 2021, the green one, most of those made it up. So they managed to get up at the end of 2022. So this tells you it's a very fluid situation, but it actually tells you that a lot of firms that were impacted managed to get back before the new shock. And actually, there was even a group of firms that never was impacted by the pandemic in terms of sales. And that tells you that the shock, the new shock, the war and the energy shock that we have seen now, touched the firms that were in pretty good conditions. But then the new shock comes, and that's what we are all worried about at this point of time. If we think at the firms, in the next slide, what I wanted to show was three different elements. The first one is the perception of firms in terms of how they see the general economic climate and the political and regulatory climate. And negative numbers means that more firms see a deterioration rather than an improvement, and we have negative numbers. So actually, firms are seeing a deterioration of the general economic climate and political and regulatory environment, and that was already over the summer. But the second part is even more interesting. We ask firms since 2016 to tell us which are the big impediments to investment activities. Usually in the last year, we always had two impediments peaking and competing on who is the worst. Actually was availability of staff with the right skills or uncertainty about the future. And now this year we have another impediment that starts from very low but starts picking up, and it's actually one of the top impediments, and that's energy cost. So it's really the energy shock crisis was coming up as one of the main impediments for firms' investment activities, together with the other two, uncertainty and availability of skills, that still remain quite important. So on the first point of view, we see the challenge coming up. And to those, you have to add the other challenge related to forthcoming slowdown of growth, and in some cases, recession, and sure we will talk about it, and also tightening of financial condition.
Yeah, I want to get into the tightening of the financial conditions for a moment. But first, what are we seeing in the financial markets broadly, both Ben and Balázs? And then, if you could also address access to funding. And I know that Deborah has something to add about that as well. But what do you see in the financial markets across Europe?
Well, first of all, I think I would highlight that compared to 2008 or 2012, when there were previous financial crises, that the balance sheets of banks especially are much stronger, and you don't hear concerns about any kind of systemic financial instability happening. Now, that said, financial conditions are tightening. Both the Fed and the ECB are raising interest rates to counter high inflation. And this makes borrowing more expensive, particularly for households, particularly for firms. And so firms, as Deborah was saying, before they were grappling with supply chain problems caused by COVID, and then uncertainty about what that was going to be. And just as we were coming out and things were looking up, suddenly they're hit by this big energy shock where they have much higher input prices. And I think that one positive thing to mention is that thus far it appears that firms have been able to pass along a lot of these price increases to consumers. So firms still have pricing power. But I think eventually it's going to weigh on their profitability, weigh on their free cash flow. And that combined with tighter financial conditions and ongoing uncertainty about the war and about COVID policies in China and things like that mean that investment is set to decline next year and probably remain relatively weak for the next couple of years. I don't know if you want to add something, Balazs.
I think that was pretty comprehensive. So not. I just wanted to perhaps also touch a little bit upon how the financial conditions are affecting households, and in particular the housing sector, right? Because that's the main channel how the financial sector would affect households. And actually, just wanted to mention that in Europe, we're lucky in the sense that the most of the mortgages, the mortgage loans that the households have are fixed rate, meaning that the impact of the financial tightening conditions are not affecting them right away. So we don't expect as we don't expect companies to their bankruptcy rate to go up in the near future. We also don't expect that the households non-performing loans would go up due to the tightening financial conditions.
Yeah, but there is a connection between rising interest rates and also the government's ability to support, to implement measures that support households. So I know, I seem to recall there was a discussion in Germany about, capping energy prices. And it gets harder and harder. And Germany is a relatively wealthy country. How is this going in other countries in terms of supporting households and with the energy cost?
I think it's important to keep in mind just how large the scale of this energy shock is. In sort of parochial terms, imagine your monthly gas bill at your house and adding a zero to the end of it, because that's sort of the scale of the energy price increases for natural gas that we've seen in Europe. Now, of course, even middle-class people can't afford that kind of an increase. And so governments have been taking measures to limit the price increases. And that has been very helpful and has both preserved some purchasing power on the part of households and also, in some cases, limited the inflationary impact of higher energy prices. Having said that, this is all a really big terms of trade shock for Europe. And the Commission is estimating that this sort of global transfer of income, that Europe has to spend more on imported energy, which is lowering the purchasing power of households, and the euro has gone down, that there's been this cumulative transfer of about 3.3% of GDP in 21 and 22. Now that's a pretty big cost, and that is a big part of the slowdown and why things have changed so abruptly from this almost euphoric COVID reopening to the harsh reality that there is a war on Europe's footsteps, and that Europe found itself overly reliant on energy imports, particularly fossil fuel energy imports from Russia.
So
can I just add to that? So just another nice number that I wanted to throw in to what Ben has already said about the 3.3% of GDP in terms of trade shock. So another way to illustrate that would be that it's about 1,000 euros or $1,000 cost per person. That's the kind of shock that we're talking about. And I think you raise a very valid point, or more like a very vivid question in the minds of policymakers in Europe right now, because the question is, how do you cushion the shock for households when you have such a large energy price increase without sort of destroying the market mechanism? Because that's also important, that the higher, obviously, especially in the context of, we're going to talk about later, the context of green transition, you want to have prices that actually show the entire costs of these dirty energy. So how do you protect the mechanism, the market mechanism, and the households at the same time? And this is a very important policy debate that we are having right now in Europe. And I think that the overall consensus is that it is okay to some degree to protect households from this huge income reduction by social transfers. But it should be done in a way, like, for example, what Germany did. It should be done in a way that at the margin, the price mechanism still works. So meaning that up to perhaps a certain consumption level, you can compensate them, but above that level, they would have to pay the full price. So there's demand reduction, not only. So it's easier to meet lower supply if you also manage to reduce demand. So that's what I wanted to add. It just on this chart, since Edith has this on the screen. I wanted to highlight that in Europe, actually, gas prices are more important than oil prices, like in the US. So why is that? The reason is that as many of the energy production technology has evolved, and we no longer, I mean, less so, we're burning coal or oil to produce energy. There are other energy sources, renewable green energy sources, but those are not that reliable. They are intermittent, and therefore gas-fired energy plants are actually the ones which are stepping in or stepping out of the market for production whenever there's extra energy or lack of energy. So this is why it's very important in Europe what gas prices are doing, because they directly feed into electricity prices, which the households are feeling.
Yeah, to stay on that for a second, gas and oil prices. Obviously, the oil price is pegged against the dollar. What about the dollar-euro exchange rate? How is that affecting, pricing? How is that affecting Europe, the European economy, other participants in the economy?
Contributing to the terms of trade shock in the sense that, because oil imports are invoiced in dollars and the euro falls against the dollar, then it gets even more expensive for Europe to import all this energy. But on the other side of that, there are benefits too, because there is still pent-up demand for travel, and particularly international travel. And this particularly benefits some of the countries in Europe like Spain and Italy and France that have really enormous tourism sectors, and we're already benefiting earlier this year, and that should continue because it's just getting cheaper to take a holiday. So that will show up in the economic data as services exports, but a lot of that has to do with just tourism spending. To come back a little bit to energy, I want to just highlight that last year in 2021, Russian natural gas imports were 45% of all of Europe's gas imports, and that has now fallen to around 10%. So there was this, really massive contraction, and Europe has had to think about diversifying its sources. On the one hand, it's boosted imports from North Africa and countries like Norway and the United States that have the capacity to ship more gas, either via pipelines or via LNG. But there are also a lot of steps being taken to make Europe more energy efficient and reduce energy usage and boost the use of renewable energy sources as much as possible. It's just that the time frame of this which was already planned because of climate change commitments, has now had to be drastically accelerated.
Yeah, we're going to get deeper into that in a minute. I want to come back real quick about to the you know, really economic or investment climate across Europe. I mean, we said you know, sentiment is down, both the households and corporates. What has, you know, and going a little bit back towards a post-pandemic, Deborah, you said that the, you know, the sentiment was more upbeat. Now, you know, it's, you know, corporates have become more risk averse, or risk aware, I should say. There are other risks that are impacting their willingness to make a commitment. What are we seeing in terms of the ability for corporates to self-finance, to their access to external funding? I mean, this ties in with interest rates going up, and you know, it affects corporate bonds. I mean, the bond market here in the US is going crazy. What's the situation in Europe?
I think what we see is that actually gradually the tightening of a monetary policy that we see in Europe as globally is reflecting also on the financing of companies. And actually, what is interesting is, again, I go back to the survey, and I think it's a slide 4 that I wanted to show. What we were seeing was that we see a deterioration of expectation in terms of availability of internal finance for firms, but still you see slightly positive number. That means that there are still more firms that think this will improve rather than decline, but you get closer to zero. So you see this is a deteriorating situation, but where the deterioration is much stronger is on access to external finance. So you have much more firms that think this will deteriorate rather than improve. And then we have a second indicator that is actually the percentage of firms that are finance constrained. And here we define finance constrained firms, those firms that either they apply for a loan and they get refused, or they apply for the loan, they don't get all what they wanted, or they get the loan but they find it too expensive and they don't take it, or even firms that are discouraged ex ante, so they just don't ask the loan because they think they will be refused. And what you see is you have an average at the European level that is 6.2%. It seems a low number, but actually historically at the European level it's quite high, and it's comparable to levels that we had in a crisis period in the past. And actually what is interesting is that the jump between 4.7 last year and 6.2 this year is actually quite a big jump. And also the other factor that I point is that if we look at the EU countries, particularly in Central Eastern Europe, we have a high share of firms that are financially constrained. You actually have countries where the ratio goes to 15%. Those are really high numbers in terms of finance constraints. So actually the access to finance is going to be a much stronger factor affecting firms' activities and investment decision going forward.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. With that said, I attended a really interesting discussion at CUNY a couple of weeks ago with Claudia Sam and Paul Krugman, among others. And the sentiment for all of the four participants at that panel was that the way we're measuring you know, the algorithms that we're using, and the the way these economic numbers are calculated and forecasting is being done, that in a situation now post-COVID and with a war going on, that we need to change, how the parameters is the word I'm looking for, that we need to reevaluate the parameters that go into these assessment. And I don't know if you want to comment on that this particular forecast that was just released by the Commission had is taking that into consideration, is adding a different, ways of measuring the data that we're looking at right now. I don't know if any one of you wants to comment on that.
I mean, obviously forecasts would have to work with the data that they have, the official data. So I'm not sure if there's any sort of any intention to look into other data. But when you talk about the perimeters, I think that's an interesting question. And if you're looking at, maybe we could look at the labor market slides. That's slide number 3. Because what I wanted to talk about is about the parameters is more about the beverage curve that we see in Europe, where beverage curve is where you have the vacancy on the y-axis and you have the unemployment on the x-axis, and this is an expression of how basically what we're looking at is whether the adjustment in the labor market to the current developments, meaning that tightening financial conditions and slowing growth, whether the adjustment in the labor market would first come from lower vacancy ratios compared to unemployment, or whether they would directly go into higher unemployment as we go forward. And this is the same discussion that the US is having, like whether there's a soft landing in the labor market due to financial conditions. And actually, when the Commission's forecast looks at this in one of the boxes or annexes that in the forecast, and they find that to their understanding of the data, the parameters have not changed, in the sense that that it's fair to expect that as the growth slows, financial conditions or inflation is ever higher, then first the adjustment would be on the vacancy rate coming down, tightness of the labor market would come down. And this feeds into very nicely to what Deborah was saying about what's the limiting factor of firms. So we have seen for a long time, and she showed this chart, that the labor skills is one of the huge limiting factors of the firms. And this is the reason why we think that the perimeters of the beverage curve has not changed. And we can expect a soft landing in the labor market in that respect. And since we have this chart on the screen, I just wanted to mention, as we gradually have moved over from how strong the economy was after COVID into what the forecast is, I just wanted to show that our expectations are exactly for this reason, what we just discussed, is that labor market is going to remain a bright spot for the economy in Europe. So there seems to be that even though households have drawn down much of the excess reserve that they have accumulated during the COVID crisis because of the precautionary savings and forced savings and additional fiscal support, they have drawn down, but they still have some buffer in terms of savings that they can still go on and support spending, and they still have good employment perspectives going forward because of the strength of the labor market. Actually, if now that we're talking about the labor market, so if you think about the 2020, the first half of 2020, the COVID shock, real GDP dropped by more than 14%, but employment has only dropped about 3%. And this was mostly due to the retention schemes, the job retention schemes that Europe has. And that worked out very nicely because most of the adjustment was in hours worked rather than employment. So this skills matching has remained, and this meant that as the workers got back into the labor market, they actually were able to recuperate all of the losses in employment and all of the losses in working hours, and they still remain strong going forward, and that can support the recovery in Europe.
Yeah, and I mean, we saw from Deborah's slide that if the corporates still have, savings and, high levels of resiliency. But the issue is that the risk, they're more and more risk averse. But what I want to address real quick before we move on to the next topic is investment growth is, from what I saw in the report, is still under pressure, and we talked about the borrowing cost. But it's also supply side issues and the reduction in global demand. Balazs or Ben, do you want to talk about that a little bit, what we're seeing there? And I don't know if you want to address the commodity prices, but let's talk about first the reduction of global demand, and then remaining supply side issues.
Well, Yvonne, as you know, Europe is a very open economy with that's very open to trade and investment, and so it's the health of the global economy is super important for European firms and the economy more broadly. And here, there's been a weakening in the global economy. I mean, in the case of China in particular, the decision to continue pursuing zero COVID policies has had a pretty big impact on Chinese growth, and has also contributed to snarled supply chains that have continued to make it difficult. Even though supply chains are improving, they've continued to make it difficult for corporates to manage the delivery of inputs that arrive in time to keep their factories going. So this has been a problem. In the United States, we've also seen a slowdown. As Balazs mentioned earlier, there was actually a technical recession in the US in the first half of the year, where we had 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. This is a little bit strange, and I think it speaks to your earlier point about thinking more broadly about what data to pay attention to, because it's strange that you could have in the United States an unemployment rate hovering around 3.5%, a historic low, and at the same time have GDP declining. And so that's leading a lot of people to scratch their heads and think, what is going on? In Europe, I think the European cycle is a little bit behind the United States in terms of when it's coming out of COVID and how rapidly inflation has increased and stuff like that. But one of the reasons why the growth outlook in Europe isn't better, not that it's, once we have this weakness in 2023, there's a recovery expected in 24. But one of the reasons that the recovery isn't expected to be stronger is because demand in the rest of the world is forecast to be weak. It's hard to make generalizations about this because there's so many different parts of the world to talk about. Many emerging market economies have been hurt by the rise in the dollar that makes, imports of all kinds of traded goods that are invoiced in dollars more expensive for them. Of course, there's a subset of energy exporters and commodity exporters that have done well. So that's not across the board for emerging markets. There's a lot of speculation about what's going to happen in China, because there have been weaknesses in the Chinese housing sector that could weigh on Chinese growth, but who knows? And in the United States, the outlook is, I would say, dominated by people wondering how high is the Fed going to raise interest rates, and how long is monetary policy going to continue to be restrictive. The longer that it takes, the more damage will happen to the real economy in the United States, and the less demand there will be for European exports. But the one positive thing that I've mentioned before, but I'll say again, is that up until now, European companies seem to have maintained a lot of pricing power. And so that's a good thing, but there's a risk that corporate profits, corporate earnings will be squeezed in the year ahead.
Yeah, and I think we've seen this. There is. I mean, I still, when I'm talking to EACC members and economists here in the U.S., there's a lot of what we call dry powder lying around, but the problem remains that companies and investment funds don't want to part with it because they're extremely risk averse. Looking at inflation, looking at a possible recession in the US and elsewhere, and then also looking at how the war is going to develop and what that continues to mean, how that is going to affect the global economy. We can't have a conversation about the business climate without talking about recession concerns. I want to just add a couple more thoughts from each of you, Deborah, what you're seeing, on this, and also I want to throw the question in: is a 2% medium just a number that is too low? Should that really be, with everything we've seen over the last decade, should that come up and be raised to 3%? Just want to get your take on that.
I may intervene, but I saw you were directing to Ben and Balash, but I can intervene on this. I think actually that we are the driving factor that is really waiting is a lot of uncertainty. So we come from a series of shocks, and now we have a new shock, and we still have many elements that remain uncertain. Is strange to talk about the uncertainty on uncertainty, but it's true. And we have so many things that can go wrong from now on. We try, and I think what the Commission is doing in this forecast is to try to stick to the element that the negative aspect that are sure for now, but there is still a lot of things that can go worse than what is in the forecast today. I personally am concerned on something more in the medium term, but that is a concern, but it's also a potential for actually turning it more on the positive side on the long term. And I come to the point. So Europe is in this moment particularly under stress at the local level because of the energy shock. The energy shock, because of many reasons, is much stronger in Europe than in other parts of the world. But this also pose a very strong incentive for transformation on the European energy market, number one, and on firms as well. And partly it's thinking how to transform to remain competitive in the medium term. So we now have the energy shock. We know, and I think the Commission was very clear saying we may see up and down, we see a lot of volatility, but mind the gap and mind the next winter may even be worse than this one. So it's not going to be something that we think it's affecting the economy for 1 year. It's probably going to be there for 2 years, and maybe it will stay there or even longer, in the sense that it's difficult to think that for German industry, energy prices in the long term will be lower than what the Russian cheap gas was providing in the past. So this brings an incentive to transform today, incentive to transform that goes at various levels. Energy efficiency, more investment in renewable energy, that's for sure. More trying to innovate in order to more innovation, also green innovation, but also, and that may come at the European level, is also some rethinking of the energy market as a single market. it's a difficult word to speak about Europe, but it's true that what the shock proved today is that we don't have many buffers at the European level, and those had to be recreated very quickly in the moment in which the shock was coming in. And that's something that we have to think for the future. But all of this story may bring a potential upside. So for now, it's an enormous shock. It may go wrong if you want, but it also can bring a potential strong upside for more efficiency in the energy market in Europe, and then also more competitiveness for firms going forward.
Thank you for that. Balázs, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah. If I can come in on a couple of things that we've been discussing. So we've been discussing sentiment. So maybe if we turn on the other slide deck and go to slide 5, which actually we have a chart on the sentiment, and we've been discussing a lot about why corporates think that their sentiment has gone down a lot. This is mainly due to, as we discussed, high energy and production costs, still lingering supply side bottlenecks and uncertainty, and all of those things that Deborah has already mentioned. But again, I also, just like Deborah, I wanted to a little bit put a positive spin on this. So going forward, we can expect that the most of these limiting factors will gradually ease. For example, the supply bottlenecks, as Ben was talking about, China, perhaps the loosening of the zero COVID policy, coming more back online. Although external demand may not accelerate very fast, but we can expect that some of these conditions are gonna ease. For example, inflation is expected to come down, right? Energy inflation. Plus, although the forecast is currently incorporating only the policy measures that were announced in time for the forecast, meaning that some of the energy support measures of member states, according to the forecast, will expire sometime in 2023. But in all honesty, we can expect that member states or governments going to extend some of these energy policies, and some of these support measures also go to corporates, not necessarily only to households. So all in all, in our forecast, in our investment forecast for corporates, it's more of a touch and go. So they sort of come down in their forecast because of the uncertainty, because also the capacity utilization is not that super high right now. But it will rebound back again in 2024. So I think that's fair to say. And just one comment on the commodity prices and shock that you were mentioning beforehand. And just to mention, augment what Ben has already said, that it seems like European firms have kept their pricing power, which is a very good news. So in fact, that the Commission is also looking at how much their market share, because of these negative terms of trade shock, has been declining this year. And it seems that it's about 1/3 of what one might have expected, just purely because of this high energy and commodity price shocks. So actually, they were able to pass on some of the price increases to their customers, and therefore maintained. They didn't. Their market share didn't decline that much. So that also bodes well for the future as we go forward.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about, the transformation and innovation. If each one of you can just one quick comment of how well prepared are European corporates to, coming out of COVID and looking at, climate change. The climate change discussion didn't start with the war in Ukraine. We had a climate change discussion when I was still living in Germany. What is the sentiment, and how prepared are companies for the green transition in particular? I don't know, Deborah, I know that this was part of of your survey.
Yeah, maybe I may start on something on the digital side. So actually, it's what we have seen coming out from the pandemic was that the pandemic was actually a moment for transformation of firms, and actually also thanks to the policy support. What we saw that it allowed firms to preserve investment activities when investment was mostly associated to digitalization. And so over the pandemic, we saw that the firms continued some kind of investment, in particular the digitalization one, and that allowed them to actually then catch the positive recovery that we have seen, and actually had a positive effect on firms later on. What we see in our survey is actually that we look at advanced digitalization, European and US firms. That's mostly adoption of advanced digital technologies. What we have seen is that in this year, actually, what used to be a relatively big gap for the between US and EU firms has been closing. And that's actually is a positive message in terms of using a crisis for transforming in terms of digitalization. Now, the second point is related to investing to deal with the climate transition. And here, again, I think what we are seeing at the European level is something positive also when compared to the US firms. We have two metrics here. On the one side, we look at firm perception of transition risk. So the risk that all the regulatory framework will change and you have to take into account all this transformation. And actually, what we see is that the European firms tend to be slightly more aware of the American ones, of what the transition, the green transition will imply for them. They see the cost, the risk, but they also are good in seeing the opportunity this may generate, and they get prepared for that. And partly it's related to the whole narrative in the recovery from the pandemic, and now that it's kept in place in taking the green transition as a fundamental policy response at the European level, and is also associating with the awareness of firms. Then we have the second metrics, and that's on perception of physical risk. That is something much more objective. So you have been affected by a flood, or you have seen already the effect of physical risk for your firms. There, the awareness between European firms and the US firms seems to be more or less the same. But on the transition part, it's quite interesting to see this much more awareness of European firms, and also their playing, also knowing the potential upside associated to that. We also have in our survey, and those are the two graphs that I show at the bottom, we are asking to firms, and those are only for the European one, whether they are taking measures to deal with mitigation. And there you see that 88% of European firms are doing something. Mostly they are doing energy efficiency or waste management, but you also have, particularly in highly energy intensive industries, you have a certain share of firms at 32% that are actually changing technologies to really try to move from sectors that are more polluting, more energy intensive, and trying to transform completely their business. What we don't see that much, and at the European level, we see only 33% of firms that are actually doing something for adaptation. So for facing for creating a protection against the effect of climate change on the firms. And that's because still it's perceived as being something where it's very difficult to plan as a firm for yourself. You think that it's more something that should come from external to protect you, but it's more difficult for firms to think that you have to build your own barrier, not to be flooded. It's something out of the mentality of firms. But that's something where, on a policy point of view, I think, and at a European level, there is a lot of focus on trying to raise awareness and also try to make it more easier for firms to also internalize this kind of investment.
Yeah, interesting. We absolutely, obviously, speaking of climate change, I want to dive in onto the energy question a little bit deeper. And so the natural gas reserves are across Europe are about 90% full. Although the Russian imports have fallen from 40 to 10%, as Ben mentioned earlier. How is this, what are the expectations of how this is going to develop? This winter, it looks like we seem to be all right. What's happening next winter? What's happening on the ground, in terms of the energy infrastructure? And, how are households and business getting support to ease the pain of on their bills? But more importantly, what is happening on the energy infrastructure? How long can we, what will it take to wean us off of Russian oil and gas?
So maybe I could tie this into a couple of the points that Deborah just made about the realization that there is opportunity as well as a challenge here. I think one of the main lessons of the war and the shutting off of Russian energy supplies for Europe is that, traditionally when people have talked about climate change, they've talked about things like carbon taxes and moving incentives so that consumers will slowly move away from purchasing big gas guzzling vehicles and the like, and get more energy efficiency in their purchases. And I think that one of the lessons here is that when you have a shock like this, you see that really the solution to these problems requires massive investments. It's price mechanisms matter, and you don't want to get rid of the price mechanisms in energy markets. But when energy prices rise this much, it's too big a shock. The economy cannot handle, firms cannot handle this big of a shock without bad things happening. And so this is where I think the policy response really comes in. And one of the reasons why investment is going to hold up as well as it is in Europe over the next couple of years is because of the Recovery and Resolution Fund and because of Repower EU initiatives that are putting a lot of money on the table to do everything from increase energy efficiency and simple ways as providing grants or tax deductions for people to put double glazed windows on their houses or put more insulation in, to more efforts to promote electric vehicle use. But I think the truth is that a lot more needs to happen. If Europe is going to diversify its fossil fuel supplies in the short to medium term, they simply need more capacity to import LNG. They need more pipelines to move that LNG around and get to where it needs to be, not just households, but factories that use natural gas as feedstock to make chemicals or fertilizers or things like that. And a lot of the existing infrastructure has been set up to use pipelines that ultimately come from Russia. And so there's massive investments in infrastructure that need to happen. And there's also massive investments in renewable energy capacity that need to happen. I'm talking about things like solar panels and windmills and on and on.
But also, if I may jump in, also more coordination across Europe. I seem to recall that there's no connection between the Spanish pipelines and the rest of Europe. So there's, the theme of the program is how much closer does Europe have to come together? I think there's something left. I mean, it seems like we're quite well prepared, but more needs to happen and more on a European level to really tighten this up.
That's right. And in terms of the forecast, let me just say one thing and then you can take over, Blaž. I think, the forecast, when you're making forecasts, you have to make some pretty big assumptions. And the forecast here is that there will not be any energy disruptions next winter. It's clearly a risk, and the Commission knows it's a risk and acknowledges it, but that's not in the forecast. There's continued uncertainty about how long the war is going to last. The forecast assumes that hostilities are going to continue throughout the forecast horizon and that all the Russian sanctions and things are going to stay in place. But also a key risk that I want to highlight is the policy risk, because and this is an upside risk, not a downside risk, if Europe can continue to use the policy tools that it has, like Repower EU and like the RRF, to continue investment and to deepen and strengthen energy markets in Europe, then the outlook for consumption and investment and growth is going to be better. This is clearly an example where common EU policies that promote investment and get the private sector to pile in after public money is being spent. These are things that it's very clear where if you have a common strategy, if you have common tools, you're going to get better outcomes.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in. I think you said it's very difficult to jump in because you said it so nicely, but let me try nonetheless. So I think Yvonne has a point about infrastructure. If you just think about, was it like about a month ago, I would say, when for about an hour, gas prices in Europe went into negative territory, and that's kind of surprising, right? When everybody's talking about how high gas prices are, energy prices are, and so what happened there? So the problem was that as Europe was filling up their gas storages and LNG was coming in, we were already at like 94%, as you say. And LNG wasn't coming in at the point where you had free capacity to store them. So that's when, once of a sudden, you couldn't put them anywhere else, right? And that's why the prices dropped to negative. So that shows very nicely that how much more, not just storage capacity, but also infrastructure we need. But as Ben has already alluded to it, we have the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which has been conceived for the pandemic recovery, but it's also been the main themes of that has been the green and digital transition, and we can nicely use that to accelerate the transition and make better use of that. So just to, if I quickly want to add numbers to what we're talking about. So in 2020. This year so far, there has been around 135 billion euros dispersed through the Recovery and Resilience Fund, and much of that, or like a big portion of that, was for green transition and digital transition. And that's actually going to only increase the disbursement next year. So the Commission is actually foreseeing that the 2023 will be the largest disbursement throughout the 6 years of the program, so that we can also hope that will give a big boost to green investments and firm investments in general.
Yeah, and I think a good part about this is that this is not something that is happening in the future. This is something that's happening already. This money has already been left the bank, and the countries that are receiving the money have started implementing the structural reforms and have shovel-ready project, as we call them here in the United States, that are now being being implemented or being executed against. So we're not behind. We're actually ahead of the game. We kind of got lucky with coming prepared out of the pandemic, and are now starting to implement. do we want to talk a little bit about our resolve to combat authoritarian threats and the rule of law? And because the question that we're getting here often is, how willing are we to suffer when the assessment is incorrect and energy prices continue to rise? Do we want to comment on that, or do we want to stay on the business side?
Very, very shortly, I just wanted to add that Europe is taking the big part of the burden, right? So Europe is very close to, obviously, to Ukraine, dependent on Russian gas and so on. So the sanction regime that has been enacted for against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, and all the support that we are giving together with the US, of course, to Ukraine, is a big cost, and Europe and households are actually willing to take that cost. So that's a pretty obvious in the policy decisions that we are willing to shoulder some of that pain for Ukraine.
Yeah, I think there's a political willingness on both sides of the Atlantic to continue supporting the efforts in Ukraine. I'm not sure if this is the latest figure, but I think that the EU all in has already contributed roughly 19 billion euros in macro financial assistance to Ukraine. And that doesn't count the costs of the roughly 4.5 million refugees that are currently being cared for in Europe. And of course, on top of that, there's the economic costs caused by this commodity price shock. I will note we just had the midterm elections in the United States, and expectations that there was going to be this red wave where Republicans were going to take over both the House and the Senate, perhaps in part because of the increase in energy prices in the US and consumers being mad about that and high inflation and why is all this money being spent on Ukraine? The red wave didn't really materialize. The Democrats maintained control of the Senate, and it seems that there's going to be continued efforts both in the US and Europe to keep going with the policy support.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, I think we are looking at or at least that's what I heard from you. There's going to be, a decrease in growth, or as other people call it, a recession. But who assumes that growth is eternal? But there are major risk factors remaining. And, despite the momentum that we got out of the first half of the year, looking beyond the short term, where do you see the major risks, and to each one of you, where are the major risks that we still need to factor in, and what, in your view, are the structural strengths and the adaptive capacity for Europe to tackle those risks? Balázs, do you want to start?
I can. So I think we've gone through this in one way or the other, but I think the major risks that we're facing is the if inflation doesn't come down, or especially energy inflation doesn't come down as they should be, then of course it's a problem. There's a risk, maybe less so in Europe, because we talked about it, that how the cycle is a little bit different from the US cycle. So there's a risk that that monetary policy is over tightening. That could be a risk. But overall, I think as we illustrated during this discussion, the EU economy is on a strong footing coming out of the pandemic, and despite all the headwinds, we are confident that after this touch and go short-lived recession, it can rebound in relatively moderate terms.
Good. Deborah?
I think I think I go back to say risk and opportunity. I think the risk is that the energy shock may materialize longer than we probably think, and that the capacity of the system to adapt to a new reality with structurally higher energy prices will be more difficult, so that it doesn't go so smoothly and so fast as we are thinking. But on the other side, this is a risk, but on the other side, it gives us an opportunity. In Europe, many things happen in crisis time, and it gives us an opportunity to rethink at the energy market in a different way, rethink it in a way that will make Europe more competitive and more aligned with a single market, also in terms of energy.
Ben?
Yeah, and let's not forget that Europe is continuing to expand and deepen in terms of its institutions. We've got Croatia that's going to join the Euro area in January. We've got all these efforts to deepen the energy market in Europe and make it more sustainable, but also more effective. And we've accepted the application of Ukraine and Georgia, I believe, too, to perhaps one day join the EU. So there's lots of challenges, but out of challenges come opportunities. And as the old cliche says, Europe is always forged in crisis. So I think we can hope that that will continue.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, everyone. So this concludes today's webinar. Thank you to our panelists, Ben, Balázs, and Deborah. And a quick reminder, if you're a member of the EACC, we're happy to connect you to the other participants today. Just give us a call and we're happy to facilitate that. We have a couple interesting programs coming up: EU-US relationship beyond the midterms, the disconnected workforce, digital transformation in the financial sector, and the new landscape in M&A compliance. You find all of them on our website. And that's why we also have a link to this recording of this program. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day.